Good morning. Thanks, Matt. I'd like to thank the Bus Industry Confederation and the Bus and Coach Association of New Zealand for the opportunity to speak today at today's conference. It's nice to be here in Cairns representing Infrastructure Australia. For those of you who don't know who Infrastructure Australia is, we're the nation's independent infrastructure advisor. We were formed in 2008 to provide independent advice to all levels of government. We do that through the Australian Infrastructure Audit and the Australian Infrastructure Plan, and we also do it through our Reform Series. It's our job to prioritise Australia's infrastructure investment needs, and it's our job to champion the big picture view of Australia's infrastructure reform and investment needs, something which, as we've heard today, is becoming increasingly important as we plan for a bigger Australia. In the coming 30 years, Australia's population is expected to increase by around 12 million people. That means that by 2046, Australia will be home to about 35 million people. That's the equivalent of adding a new city roughly the size of Canberra, or 3 cities the size of Cairns, to the nation each year for the next 30 years. This growth is a good thing. It provides Australia with the opportunity to boost our productivity, to strengthen our labour force and the domestic market for businesses, and also to enhance the diversity of our communities. But to maximise the opportunities afforded by population growth, we need to ensure that our cities remain great places to live and to work. And with this in mind, my remarks this morning will focus on the implications of Australia's growth for land use, infrastructure and transport. I'll discuss opportunities for the bus sector, as highlighted in the 2018 Infrastructure Priority List, and I'll also provide a glimpse of an upcoming Reform Series publication which investigates public transport in outer urban areas. Australia's future population growth will be most concentrated in our cities. 75% of the growth is expected to occur in Brisbane, Perth, Melbourne and Sydney. Growth on that scale will transform these cities. The potential benefits are immense. And as our population grows, Australia is becoming increasingly urbanised, and so is our economy. In 2016-17, our 4 largest cities generated over 60% of Australia's gross domestic product. Australia's long-term prosperity is increasingly linked to the performance of our cities, and attracting and retaining businesses and skilled workers will be key. But to do that, our cities must remain efficient and livable as they grow. In other words, we need well-planned cities. We need the location of jobs, homes and infrastructure networks to be coordinated to maximise accessibility and livability, and increasing the capacity of our public transport networks will be crucial. That includes building new infrastructure, as well as making the most of the infrastructure we already have. Earlier this year, Infrastructure Australia published Future Cities. Future Cities provides a useful starting point for understanding the challenges our cities are likely to face. It emphasises the need for investment in public transport if we're to maintain our great cities. Future Cities considered 3 30-year growth scenarios for 2 sample cities: low, medium and high density versions of the future. And in each version of the future, we looked at the performance of the transport network, access to jobs, emissions from cars, access to schools, hospitals and green spaces. Our research shows that Australians face a complex set of choices regarding what the future will look like. Should our cities grow up or out? How do we align the location of jobs with the needs of our changing economy? How do our infrastructure networks change to accommodate more demand? How can we ensure that the world-class livability of our cities is maintained and enhanced? These are difficult decisions, with each requiring trade-offs and compromise. But inaction isn't an option, nor is business as usual. If we fail to effectively anticipate and respond to growth, the likely results will be declining economic productivity, increasing environmental pressures and a marked reduction in the quality of life. Growth isn't the only challenge faced by Australia's cities. As we've heard, fundamental shifts are having a significant impact on the structure and operation of our cities, and on the infrastructure required to support them. In our Future Cities report, we acknowledge 6 major influences. The first is an ageing population. Over the next 40 years, the proportion of Australian population aged 65 and over, will increase significantly, while the proportion of working-age people will decrease. This means that Australia's governments will face increasing fiscal gaps, which will impact on the funding available for infrastructure. The second is the rapid transformation of technology. Technology, as we've heard, is disrupting how goods and services are provided, regulated, consumed, and paid for. The third is an increasing urban freight task. According to our 2015 Australia Infrastructure Audit, Australia's containerised freight task is projected to increase by 165% to 2031, with cities being the primary location for this growth. This will have implications for urban freight networks, and particularly the first and last mile transport and handling in our cities. The fourth is the impact of climate change. The changing global climate is driving shifts in short-term weather patterns, including increased extreme weather events and long-term climate trends. At the same time, our cities are a key source of emissions and are located in areas at risk from climate impacts. The fifth is the shifting structure of national and global economies. The focus of the economy is shifting towards service and knowledge-intensive activities. Cities are an ideal location for these agglomerating economies, enabling collaboration and easy access to skilled labour. And lastly, changes to the nature and location of work. Innovation in communications, robotic technologies, artificial intelligence are enabling changes in the way that we work. A key finding from our modelling was that under all three scenarios, congestion will increase significantly. In fact, our research found that our cities are at risk of becoming congestion capitals if we let development grow unchecked on the urban fringes. And this will be costly for Australia. Congestion reduces access to jobs and to skilled labour. It has a significant impact on the national economy, potentially costing Australia as much as $53 billion by 2031 if we don't take action. It also reduces access to education, health, and social services, not to mention the green and public spaces which play an increasingly important role in our cities. Under all growth scenarios, our research found that the use and performance of public transport must improve to cater for growth. In Melbourne, for example, we found that an additional 2.8 million people will call the city home over the next 30 years. This means about 6 more million daily trips on Melbourne's roads, and about 2 million more trips on the city's public transport networks. To put that into perspective, Melbourne's public transport networks carry about 1.4 million trips each day at the moment. It's clear that our future cities require high-quality public transport. That's why one of Future Cities' recommendations is that Australia's governments focus on increasing the reach, capacity and sustainability of our public transport networks. The paper also recommends that land use planning and public transport investment are supported by technology and network optimisation to make the most of the assets we already have. We see technology playing an increasingly important role in our public transport networks. Buses have a particularly important role to play in integrated transport networks, given their flexibility and adaptability to changing travel needs, with a unique ability to service both low and high density areas and cover the main journey and feeder trips. Buses form a critical part of our transport networks. The key challenge for planners is to pinpoint exactly where we need to increase the capacity of bus routes and to deliver more efficient journeys where they're needed most. On this point, our Future Cities report urges Australia's governments to improve the flexibility, transparency and sophistication of strategic plans. In particular, we would like to see Australia's governments use more flexible planning tools like scenario planning to account for uncertainty and rigorously test options against different long-term outcomes. Increasing the transparency of the assumptions, data and models which inform long-term planning is important for improved decision-making and for delivering better planning outcomes. While scenario planning might seem rudimentary, the future is becoming less and less certain, as we've heard this morning. And as we look to improve long-term planning, we must also look at improving our project selection practices, which brings me to the infrastructure priority list. Maintained by Infrastructure Australia, the Infrastructure Priority List is an independent list of nationally significant investments which address our infrastructure gaps. We have a rigorous assessment process for adding projects to the list. This involves assessing the cost and benefits of problems, opportunities and solutions. We consider the strategic fit, the economic impact and the deliverability of projects. and that approach enables us to provide a high-quality selection of nationally significant infrastructure which governments can choose from. At its heart, the infrastructure priority list directs funding towards the most significant projects. It's critical that we select the projects that make the most positive contribution for the lowest cost. The list includes both projects and initiatives. Initiatives are nationally significant problems which require further development to identify the best course of action. Projects, on the other hand, are advanced proposals for which we have a fully developed business case which has been positively assessed by the independent Infrastructure Australia Board. The 2018 list identifies a $55 billion infrastructure pipeline, including 12 projects which have been assessed and recommended for delivery. And public transport is a key theme of the 2018 list, reflecting the demands of our populations. In particular, the list highlights the need for projects which build capacity on key public transport corridors. We were pleased to receive many high-quality submissions for the list this year, including many from the public transport sector. One of those is the Brisbane Metro project, which was included on the list this year. Brisbane Metro is a transformative project which will have significant benefits and support the fast-growing area of southeast Queensland. By removing a series of bottlenecks and extending the fully separated busway, the project will provide fast and frequent public transport services in near Brisbane. It will deliver travel time savings for passengers and encourage more people to use public transport. The project is also a good example of targeted investments aimed at getting more from the infrastructure we have, and collaboration with the Queensland Government and the Brisbane City Council working together to deliver the best outcomes for the community. The list also includes a number of bus priority initiatives, such as building public transport capacity in Sydney along the Parramatta Road and Victoria Road corridors. And there are initiatives and projects focused on enhancing rail networks in Perth, Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, where buses will be key in providing an integrated network. In fact, buses will continue to play a key role in all our cities, and we encourage you to continue making submissions for the list. Moving on to our reform series, I'd like to talk a little about our latest research paper, which is due for release later this month. It considers the role of buses in outer urban areas. As we plan for population growth, there's a real need to focus investment on improving public transport connections in outer urban areas. Australia's cities have experienced a degree of urban consolidation in recent years, but our outer urban areas are still growing strongly. And unfortunately, growing communities on the outskirts of our major cities are being left behind by a lack of access to public transport. Close to half the population of Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth and Adelaide live in the outer areas of these cities. A substantial number of people living in these areas don't have good access to public transport within a 15-minute walk of their home. And in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, more than 1 million people fall into this category, while 500,000 people in Perth and 200,000 people in Adelaide also have poor access to public transport. And this might worsen as our population grows. On average, people living in outer urban areas spend more on transport than inner city residents, as they're spending more on operating private vehicles because of a lack of access to public transport. Without access to a reasonable public transport services, people living or working in our outer suburbs are more reliant on their cars, meaning they shoulder the additional burden of higher operating costs, leaving less money in their pockets for household expenses. Historically, it's been very costly to deliver public transport in lower density outer suburban areas, where houses and employment centres are typically spread apart, and people prefer to drive than to take the train or to catch a bus. Australia's government should be commended for ramping up investment in public transport in recent years. However, as close to half the population of our 5 largest cities now live in the outer suburbs, it's vital that we continue to provide good public access in those areas. We believe that technology and the greater availability of data could create opportunities to improve customer services in these areas. And our report makes a case for governments to trial new models, such as on-demand buses in these areas. These trials will give us a better evidence base and enable us to see where they work well and, importantly, where they don't. These models may enable us to fill in the gaps and to provide easier access to regular bus services. We would also like governments to focus on making transfers between public transport simple and seamless. and that includes investing in well-designed interchanges, making sure that integrated ticketing systems enable people to transfer between modes and service easily. We look forward to sharing this paper with you in coming weeks. All of the research and the publications that I've talked about today are available on our website if you'd like to read them in more detail. And remember, you can also follow us on Twitter for the latest updates. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference.